I want to talk about solubility and what makes one compound soluble in another compound. And when we're looking at that, we're usually analyzing the intermolecular forces. And in general, the intermolecular forces that we've talked about can be divided into two different categories: polar intermolecular forces and nonpolar intermolecular forces. The polar intermolecular forces are anything involving ions or ionic interactions, dipole interactions like dipole-dipole intermolecular forces, and hydrogen bonding. The nonpolar intermolecular forces are generally only London dispersion forces. And in general, the general rule we can use for determining if one thing is soluble in another is like dissolves like. Things with similar intermolecular forces will dissolve in one another. And the reason for this is there's sort of a competition between the intermolecular forces between the molecules in question with themselves and with each other. So if, for instance, we look at this first case, we can talk about some sort of ionic compound interacting with itself through ionic interactions. We've got the positive charges interacting with the negative charges. If we mix this with H2O, it can use its dipole to interact with the ions. Those are both polar types of intermolecular forces, and it's these polar interactions which solvate the positive and negative ions. On the other hand, if we try to dissolve an ionic compound in a nonpolar solvent, something that can only form LDF interactions, the ionic compound is interacting with itself. There's no way that this ionic compound can interact with the nonpolar solvent. It doesn't really have anything to do with the LDF. There's no way for it to interact effectively with the LDF. So what happens is the ionic compound continues interacting with itself, forming ionic interactions. The nonpolar solvent continues interacting with itself, forming its LDF interactions, and they never interact with one another. There's no solubility that occurs. If we look at a couple more examples, if we take a nonpolar solid, something that can only form LDF with itself, and we dissolve or try to dissolve it in a nonpolar solvent, now these two compounds can form LDF with one another, so one dissolves in the other because they have similar nonpolar intermolecular forces. Finally, if we look at trying to take that nonpolar solid and dissolving it in H2O, the nonpolar solid is forming the LDF with itself. H2O is forming hydrogen bonding and dipole-dipole interactions with itself. The water interacts with itself. The nonpolar solvent interacts with itself, but they have nothing in common. There's no way for them to interact with one another, so they never do. They just stay interacting with themselves, and the nonpolar solid does not dissolve in water.